Are the elite and the educational institutions reshaping national identity by undermining historical pride and traditional values in favor of a multicultural narrative? If so, how does this shift diminish the significance of Western achievements and cultural heritage? Welcome to Riks Europe, Professor Matt Goodwin, best-selling author and broadcaster. You've written a very interesting text, The War Against Our Past, Inside the Ideological Project to Undermine Our History and Collective Memory. And I know you also reacted to a school in East Leigh that decided to ban Easter to celebrate Refugee Week instead. So starting off, you've mentioned national pride falling because of the elites. Could you tell us more about this? Are there other things at play, such as globalization, changing values?
Yeah, well, firstly, thank you for having me on. I've written a number of pieces recently on my politics newsletter, basically pointing out the hypocrisy of our ruling class here in the UK, but I think many of the arguments can be applied to other European states. What we've seen here essentially in recent months and years is a consistent attempt to prioritize minority groups over the majority and to celebrate the distinctive identity, culture, ways of life, and history of minority groups while downplaying or repudiating the identity, history, culture, and ways of life of the majority. And one shocking example of that we've seen recently here in the UK was a decision by a school to essentially fail to celebrate Easter celebrations, to effectively cancel them and replace them with a celebration of Refugee Week and to celebrate diversity. And as I say in my piece, to say that a country is welcoming of diversity is fine, but it cannot be the foundation of your entire identity, because it's like saying you have no real identity of your own. And across the West today, I think millions of people can sense that actually they are being asked, if not forced, to downplay their own identity and history and culture in preference of celebrating this very amorphous and meaningless word, diversity, or celebrate the identity and religion of minority groups. And I think people in the West are pretty sick and tired of this. I think they want to see a change, and I think they want to see a ruling class, not just in politics, but across media, across culture, across the creative industries, museums, the galleries, the universities. They want to see a ruling class that much better represents their values, their voice and their views, rather than what they've got at the moment, which is a ruling class that's pandering to, at best, a 10% elite minority. So fundamentally, people want to change this broken status quo that we're all living under.
It's talked about finding this balance, and of course what we're seeing now doesn't really seem to be so balanced. If one tradition is banned in favor of another, it doesn't really, it sort of goes against the word inclusivity, you could say. How can Britain find a balance in keeping these old traditions but with a modern diverse society, or is it the pursuit of balance that is the problem?
Well, I think we need to be clear, firstly, what we mean by words like diversity, equality, and inclusion, DEI, which has become a new religion for the ruling class. Diversity means celebrating every form of diversity except diversity of thought. We are not permitted, really, in Western societies to hold and express views that challenge or oppose the dominant orthodoxy that is being imposed on us from above. So diversity is really the new conformity. Equality means creating or generating equal outcomes among all groups while discriminating against some groups, namely members of the white Christian straight majority. And inclusion means including all groups in the conversation except those who happen to hold conservative or gender critical beliefs. So we need to be clear as to what we mean by diversity, equality, and inclusion. How do we find our way out of this? Well, my view is, firstly, Europe needs to dramatically reduce the amount of inward immigration into European and Western societies. We need to completely revise the legal architecture that surrounds our country so we can much better control our borders and much better defend our countries from illegal migration. We also need to reform the institutions, much in the way that Donald Trump is doing in the United States. rooting out DEI policies, documents, and ideology from what are supposed to be neutral, taxpayer-funded public institutions. And then I think beyond that, we need to ensure that the educational establishment, particularly schools, are not enforcing indoctrination on our children. Here in the UK, we just had one shocking finding that only 11% of young people from Gen Z, people who were born after 1996, would be prepared to fight for their country if there was a war tomorrow. And about half think that Britain is racist. That is not a coincidence. This is a first generation that's been raised amid two things. One is social media, where the liberal progressive orthodoxy is reinforced through a celebrity cultural class. And the second thing is that generation is the first to be fully indoctrinated in an educational system, which does lean quite strongly to the left and certainly advocates the goals of social liberalism, or what we might call woke progressive ideology. And so I think many people are starting to realize the effects that this political project is having. So we need to reform a lot of those things just to really begin to level the playing field and to allow us to get back to actually remembering who we are, remembering what it is that defines our civilization and what it is that created some of the most prosperous, freedom-loving nations the world has ever known.
And one thing I mentioned in the beginning was the root cause being the elite. Could you tell us about this? Is it intentional, or is it a development of past decisions and society evolving?
Well, my argument is that we're living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. And by that, I mean the people who hold positions of power and influence within the institutions, particularly over the last 20 years, have been moving sharply to the left on a whole array of cultural issues, on immigration, border security, multiculturalism, diversity, gender ideology. And as they've moved sharply to the left, they've left the average voter behind them. And so the gap between the people who dominate our societies and the people who have to live with the consequences of their decisions has become much larger. And I think we've seen that in countries like Sweden, in Germany, in Italy, France, and the UK, where the people who claim to speak on our behalf don't really represent us at all, especially on these cultural questions. In almost every reliable major survey that we have, the vast majority of people want to lower migration, want to strengthen their borders, and want to live in a society that is not stifling of free speech, free expression. And they feel deeply anxious over things like the rise of Islam within Western societies, and what they see is a failure of their leaders to really deal with these challenges. And if we don't close that gap between the people on the one hand and the elites on the other, we're going to have enormous political problems over the coming years and decades, of which the political turbulence of the last decade with Trump, with Brexit, with new populist parties across Europe, I think that's just really the start of a much broader pushback by voters against this ruling class that they simply have concluded doesn't really share their beliefs and certainly doesn't even respect them.
So how can this be turned around? How can Britain and other European countries start teaching about the past in a way that will make people feel proud of their country again?
Well, I think when it comes to education, schools and universities, there's lots of things we can do. We could, as I say, root out policies that are actively promoting a political agenda. We could root out DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion policies. We could stop decolonizing university reading lists. We could have much greater monitoring of the groups and educational institutions that are brought into schools to teach children about some of these contested issues. Many of them are led by radical activists who really don't have any basis in science or evidence. They're there to essentially indoctrinate children. I think we need much better teacher training over some of these issues. I think we probably need new legislation like we've got here in the UK. We've got something called a Higher Education Free Speech Act, which means that universities that fail to uphold free speech, which fail to allow academics and students to voice alternative viewpoints, they can be fined a lot of money. Indeed, the first university here in the UK was just fined £600,000, 800, 900,000 euros for failing to uphold free speech on campus, because these institutions are not going to reform themselves. So these are some things that I think we could be doing, because primarily this is not actually just about changing politics and electing alternative politicians. Fundamentally, the problem is a cultural one. So we need to change the culture. And I think just on that point, also supporting and encouraging the development of alternative ecosystems, alternative television channels, alternative YouTube channels, alternative newsletters and blogs. All of that, I think, is important. New universities, alternative universities, like the University of Austin or the University of Buckingham here in the UK, that are very open at saying they think the legacy institutions have failed. All of that, I think, is needed in order to try and create better conditions in which we can get back to some kind of unifying identity, culture, and sense of history that fundamentally makes a nation state. Because what's happening across much of Europe, at least in my view, is because the anchors of our nation states are giving way, because we don't have that very strong sense of shared identity, shared culture, shared ways of life. Our societies are becoming more fragmented. Sectarianism is rising, whereby elections are being decided not on the basis of what's in the national interest, but rather what's in the interest of different groups, racial and religious groups. And people don't feel safe and secure. So they're hunkering down, turning away from their neighbors and questioning multiculturalism and its effects like never before. And this is exactly what academics predicted would happen, or at least a few renegade academics. About 10 years ago at Harvard, Robert Putnam did suggest that rapid rates of demographic change, rapid rates of immigration and churn would lower public trust in the overall political and economic system. And I think that's what's happening across much of Europe and the West today, where voters are just feeling that their concerns are not being met. So they're becoming much more distrustful of the established politics and of institutions. They're turning to anti-establishment parties because there's this enormous vacuum, and they're angry, they're frustrated. And to be frank, I think they've got every right to be.
And as a sort of final question, why has this become the norm? For example, choosing to not celebrate Christmas, or that hasn't happened yet, but obviously not celebrating Easter. Why has this become common practice? Is it even asked by people who aren't originally British or newcomers, so to speak? Is it demanded or requested? Why has it become the norm?
Well, in some places, Christmas has been repackaged. It's been repackaged as a winter festival. We've also had, here in the UK, we've had a number of examples of Islamic celebrations and important dates in the calendar being prioritized in the national conversation in national institutions. I think there are two things going on here that are basically going to decide how this unfolds in the coming years. The first is demands from minority groups that can often be quite dogmatic. But I think secondly, and more importantly in a way, is this obsession among the liberal ruling class with what we might call emotional safetyism, the desire to prioritize the emotional well-being of every minority group at the expense of the majority. So we must do whatever we can to make racial, sexual, gender, religious minorities feel comfortable, so they don't feel harmed or threatened in any way. And we will elevate that, we will prioritize that above the interests of the wider majority. I'll just give you one example from the UK, because I think people outside of the UK will find this quite interesting. In our legal system, this week, as I'm speaking to you in the early days of April, we've had an independent legal body advocate that members of minority groups have their identity taken into account when judges are deciding what prison sentences to give people. In other words, if you belong to an ethnic minority, if you belong to a gender minority, if you're transgender, or you're Muslim, or Sikh, or Hindu, the judge will take into account your identity characteristics in a way they would not consider if you were a white Christian male from the white British majority. Now, that sparked a very intense national debate here in the UK about what's called a two-tier justice system? Do we now have a justice system that is more interested in prioritizing the rights and interests of minority groups at the expense of the majority? Because I don't know about the people watching this show, but I believe in equality before the law, irrespective of who you are, irrespective of what your fixed identity is. Every individual should be treated equally before the law. But that is clearly no longer happening in some parts of our legal and judicial system. And this is really rooted, just lastly, in this idea that I've written about, which is called asymmetrical multiculturalism, which is a bit of a clunky term, but what it means is multiculturalism has basically become rigged. It's become biased. It's a policy framework that elevates the interests of minorities and celebrates minorities at the expense of the majority. And that's what we're seeing, I think, playing out across many Western nations today. And it's symbolized by these debates over things like Easter, Refugee Week, Christmas. Give you another example from the UK. We've just discovered we have 1 million people in this country who cannot speak English, who do not speak the national language. Now, that's unacceptable in a modern, civilized society. Yet, because we're talking about minorities, the state is not really willing to intervene and ensure that those people learn the national language. Instead, the state provides widespread translation services at the cost of millions of pounds to British taxpayers. Again, it's about leaning in too much into the interests of minority groups. And the end result is you have a more fragmented, individualistic society where people can't speak the language. And if they can't speak the language, how on earth are you ever going to unify a society like that? Because it certainly isn't a nation state. So these are the challenges I spend a lot of my time writing about. And I'm sure these are some of the challenges that will resonate with the people watching this show in other parts of Europe.
Thank you very much, Professor Matt Goodwin, a best-selling author and broadcaster, for your time today.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Riks Europe.